Hello, and happy holidays, everyone. December has always been my favorite time of year, as it's the best time to gather with friends and loved ones, to drink and be merry. Although, since seeing my friends and loved ones is now a massive health risk, I've only really been able to do the drinking part, but I'm about halfway to feeling as merry as I can right now. But all of this time alone to celebrate the holidays has given me the opportunity to watch a vast assortment of quality Christmas programming. We all have our favorites that we love to revisit year after year, but there is one in particular that upon rewatching, it's brought a lot of complex emotions and questions to mind. It does prove one thing for sure. Santa Claus is real. And as amazing as that is, the confirmation of Santa's existence brings up even more questions to mind. Like, for example, how the f*** is Santa real? I think it's safe to say that we all know about Santa by this point. He's jolly, he wears a red suit, and he's probably not a big fan of labor unions. But our entire perception of Santa is based around the month-long onslaught of Christmas media that gets released. Whether it be TV, movies, commercials, billboards, he's inescapable, whether you celebrate the holiday or not. And all of this reaffirms to the believing children of the world that Santa Claus is real. There's absolutely nothing wrong about believing in Santa when you're a kid. If anything, it made my Christmases all the more magical. But I stopped believing once his existence stopped making sense to me. And there's actually a good chunk of Christmas media out there that will play around with this concept of a character's belief in Santa being challenged in some way.
There's no Santa. No Santa.
I feel like there's a good way and a bad way to go about this. The good way being having some emphasis on the importance of believing rather than seeing. But the bad way is to do what Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer did. This straight-to-video Christmas special came out in 2000 and was directed by Phil Roman, who I was initially planning to dunk on pretty hard given everything that I have to say about this special. However, I just can't, because after doing the research, this man is kind of a legend in terms of the projects that he's worked on. On top of having credits in both animation and directing on a vast quantity of Charlie Brown specials, he's also been heavily involved in the Garfield franchise for decades as both a director and producer. His filmography even goes all the way back to the original How the Grinch Stole Christmas cartoon in 1966, and that's just scratching the surface. With a portfolio of this size, I don't think it would be much of a stretch to crown this man the king of animated TV specials. When you hear that, you might think, oh well, if he's the king of animated TV specials, then surely Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer must be his magnum opus, right? You've probably heard the song at least once in your life, as it's the quintessential goofy Christmas song that has too long of a title. Yeah, sorry I want a hippopotamus for Christmas, but you don't bring up the potentially world-building questions that this song does when you listen to it. Like, for starters, whose grandma was run over by a reindeer? How did she get run over by a reindeer? And were there ever any charges pressed against Santa for vehicular manslaughter? This special is an interesting case, as it attempts to provide a logical story to a song that was never meant to make any sense in the first place. But all that this special does in an attempt to make sense only makes things more and more confusing the more that you start to think about it. Let's walk through the plot. Jake Spankenheimer, yes, that is his last name unfortunately, loves two things in this world: his grandma and Christmas. And you'll never forget that, because he will remind you of it at least every 3 minutes.
Santa Claus is real. You with no store would be like Christmas without Santa.
Nobody understood me like Grandma did.
His older sister Daphne likes to make fun of him for still believing in Santa, while his parents seem to just change the subject whenever he asks if Santa is real. Also in this family are Grandpa, whose only defining character trait is that he's senile, and Cousin Mel, who is our main antagonist. All that Mel cares about is money, so when Grandma goes missing after her run-in with Santa, she decides to seize the opportunity to sell Grandma's store to the city's own Trump equivalent, Austin Bucks. And surprisingly, he's not as evil as she is. But that's enough about them for now. After tucking Jake into bed on Christmas Eve at what I can only imagine is 9 p.m. at the latest because everyone else in the house is still awake, the titular song begins to play, meaning we're about to see some serious shit go down. Grandma leaves the house to deliver one of her famous fruitcakes to the local shelter, but at the same moment, Jake hears the sound of sleigh bells and a ho, ho, ho. He races to the window and looks out with enthusiasm, only to be a witness to the horrors about to take place.
Grandma, watch out!
being the good grandson he is, Jake rushes downstairs to let everyone know what happened, and not a single person believes him. Except Grandpa, but again, he's senile, and apparently he just casually watched the whole thing transpire while he drank some eggnog. So when he says that he saw it too, the most that Jake's parents are willing to do is open the door and poke their heads outside for only a few seconds. It takes them until morning to finally go out and check, and sure enough, the imprint of Grandma's body along with all of her belongings are still in the snow. All of this happens not even halfway through the special, which I think is a bit of a bold move, only for how the rest of this story plays out. Normally, in order to keep up with the theme of Christmas, you'd probably expect this to turn into some kind of 24-hour mystery to find Grandma before the most magical day of the year comes to an end. But in actuality, we get treated to a time skip all the way to September of the following year, and the plot is now focusing on Cousin Mel as she attempts to sell the store now that Grandma is gone. Now look, I get that this is supposed to show us that Cousin Mel is greedy and uncaring, but if I'm going to be honest, purely from a business standpoint, selling the property is the most logical thing to do, given that the owner has been missing for 9 months and no one else other than Jake, who is a literal child, seems to be very eager to run the store. And it's not even like Mel is trying to hide the deal and keep all the money for herself, as she tells the family about it, implying that they will all get a cut of the profit. I know that she's got ulterior motives here, and that she also took advantage of Grandpa's deteriorating mental state in order to get the deed, but ethics aside, she's not really wrong here. Jake won't stand for any of this though, so despite being the only one who has the most valid reason to assume that Grandma is dead because, he witnessed her get trampled, he has the brilliant idea to send out one single email about his search for Grandma to the following address.
To Santa Claus at santaclausisreal.com.
Now this just sounds like some kind of Christmas-themed QAnon website, but fuck all that I know, because this actually turns out to be Santa's email address. You know what? Let's just take a break here for a second, because as you can probably tell, this is when I start to get a lot more frustrated than I already was. And I don't want you, the viewer, to assume that I'm some sort of Scrooge when it comes to animated Christmas specials. In fact, there are actually quite a few that I hold in very high regard. To name a few, the Hey Arnold episode entitled Arnold's Christmas is an absolute masterpiece that still manages to tug at my heartstrings upon every single viewing, lasting the test of time by teaching its audience how Christmas at its core will always be about the importance of family and selflessly giving to others. Billy and Mandy Save Christmas is another one that is high on my list, as it seamlessly blends the comedically dark elements of the show with all the typical tropes and themes of Christmas specials in a brilliantly hilarious way. And did you know that they even make a reference to Evil Dead 2?
I'll swallow your soul!
Hey, I'll swallow your soul! I'll swallow your soul! I'll swallow your soul!
And to offer a comparison to a special that is a bit similar in terms of tone, length, time of release, as well as being a musical, there's Olive the Other Reindeer. Olive isn't perfect by any means, but I do look back on it a lot more fondly, as it just clearly has so much more heart put into it. Plus we get a cameo from Ultraman and Godzilla. Or is that Jet Jaguar? Not the point. In hindsight, maybe I should have done a video talking about Olive instead. But there's just something about Grandma got run over by a reindeer that I need to get out of my system. And I think it has everything to do with how flimsy the entire plot is and how quickly the cracks in its foundation begin to appear as it goes on. It was easy to not notice these things as a kid, but now? It just doesn't make any sense. So after reading Jake's email, Santa goes to the hospital ward of his workshop, which only makes me think that work-related injuries are a very common occurrence at the North Pole. But this, as it turns out, is where Grandma Spankenheimer has been the entire time. Apparently, she was hit so hard by the reindeer that she now has a bad case of amnesia, which has made it extremely difficult for Santa to figure out who she is. Yeah, just ignore the fact that she was roughly 30 feet from the front porch. There was no way for Santa to know who she was. But now that he knows who she is, rather than taking her immediately back to the house that he hit her at, Santa tells his top elf Quincy to respond back immediately. But instead of doing that, Quincy says,
I have a better idea.
His idea is to break into Jake's room in the middle of the night to whisk him off to the North Pole. And Quincy's train of thought here is that by bringing Jake, it will bring back Grandma's memory. But that doesn't work.
Okay, I'll bite. Who is he?
I've got the secret
Even if she doesn't remember Jake yet, at least he found her. But now they have to stop Cousin Mel from selling the store. So they fly all the way back to Cityville with Grandma to stop the deal and have Santa explain everything. Wait, he can just show himself to people? He doesn't have to, like, there's no magic rule that says Santa can't. You know what? Fine, I don't care. Okay, they don't believe him for like 30 seconds, but after naming the exact toy that Austin asked for when he was 6, they immediately accept this man to be the real deal. Meanwhile, Grandma's waiting outside in the sleigh because she was too woozy to get up after the flight, which is when Mel's lawyer kidnaps her for real. And seeing how he just confessed to her initial disappearance, Santa gets thrown in jail and now has to go to court to either prove his innocence or be locked away forever.
No, God!
Which leads us now into our second time skip of the special, indicating that the third act has now begun. Cousin Mel and her lawyer have been keeping Grandma locked in a cabin in the woods all this time, psychologically torturing her via extremely out of place and cringy musical numbers.
Grandpa's gonna sue the pants off of Santa.
But the clock is ticking, and the future of Christmas is at stake. So Jake assembles a task force of the greatest minds in Cityville to help figure out who could be behind Grandma's disappearance.
Cousin Mel.
It took them 3 months to figure that shit out. I'm not going to bore you with the details about how all of this goes down, but they follow Cousin Mel to the cabin, trick her to leave, and then they get Grandma back. Now the only problem that remains is to get her memory back before the end of the trial. But how are they gonna— It's fruitcake. They get her to eat fruitcake, and that's how she remembers everything. Fruitcake is the key to all this. So now that Grandma is back for real, they rush into the courthouse to clear Santa's name. It's this scene that is supposed to be the big payoff for everything in the special, as Jake delivers a monologue explaining how all of this exonerates Santa of all charges. With Grandma and her memories back, she's able to get the charge of her disappearance cleared. With the other charges filed against Santa, such as vehicular hit and run and leaving the scene of an accident, those are a little more difficult to clear him of. But thankfully, much like restoring Grandma's memories, fruitcake is the key to all this. Mel spiked the batter of the one that Grandma was walking out of the house with that fateful night, and it apparently had a reindeer nip-like effect. But what exactly was it?
From this vial of bad stuff found at Cousin Mel's cabin.
Oh yeah, bad stuff. That's what I was gonna say. You really figured it out, Jake. I also find it funny that Jake made an entire jury eat year-old fruitcake that was found at the scene of a crime and claimed that it was the basis for a case. Fruitcake apparently goes bad after 2 to 3 months, so he basically gave them all food poisoning regardless of whether or not Mel tampered with it the previous year. The second piece of evidence to free Santa is the letter that he left at the scene after hitting Grandma. You know, like what you do when you accidentally bump someone's car in a parking lot when they aren't around. Mel noticed this letter before anyone else did, which means that she not only knew where Grandma was this entire time, but it also implies that she knew Santa was real and didn't tell Jake, and that is the greatest crime of all. But just like with the fruitcake, this is also extremely funny to me, because the fact that she didn't immediately destroy the letter upon finding it and went so far as to leave it lying out on the table in the cabin where she was keeping Grandma for months, it just makes no sense. Like, if you're gonna do a crime, do it well. Anyways, the special wraps up with all of them, minus Mel of course, leaving the courthouse happy that they can all move on with their lives. That is until Grandma decides that after all that she's been through, it's a good time to eat a celebratory piece of fruitcake. But alas, it's the expired reindeer nip one, and we get to watch her get trampled over one final time.
Not again! Grandma! Grandma!
And that's the story of how Grandma got run over by a reindeer. I'll admit that it did its best to make a story out of a wacky Christmas song, but unlike many other animated Christmas specials that are considered classics, this one just pales in comparison. The first issue that came up was Santa's existence being denied when he's clearly real, and that seems to be the catalyst for all of the inconsistencies and issues that follow. Which makes this such a slog to even try enjoying without the help of some spiked eggnog. Maybe it could have been better if Santa's existence was already a fact and not just this underwhelming reveal where characters' reactions weren't very dramatic. Like, I imagine people's reactions to seeing the real Santa for the first time would probably be more akin to someone making first contact with an alien race. People's reactions wouldn't be like, "Wow, you are Santa." They'd probably be more like, "What the fuck, Santa's real?" But I digress. Unless... What if they knew the whole time that Santa was real?
Daphne says there's no such thing as Santa. Well, that's because she doesn't believe in one kind.
Oh my god. It all makes sense now. Cousin Mel was of course the primary antagonist of the story, but it's painfully obvious to everyone that in her pursuit of fortune, she made a few obvious mistakes along the way. Mistakes that are so obvious and so easy to avoid, it's almost as if she was being manipulated without her even knowing. But who could do that, you might be asking? The answer? Frank and Rita Spankenheimer. Jake's parents have been itching to sell the store for quite a while now, as they know that the days in which Grandma will be able to operate the business herself are dwindling the older she gets. Not only that, but to operate a store that is so heavily focused on Christmas doesn't quite appeal to them as much as a check for a cool million might. After all, we even see that they both lack the Christmas spirit by getting an inflatable tree and not helping Grandma bake her fruitcake or even volunteer to put up the decorations around the house until the night before Christmas. But why? Because this whole time, the Spankenheimer family has had no interest in celebrating Christmas. Because they are Jewish. Everyone, except Grandma. Grandma married into the Spankenheimer family years ago, but coming from what I can only assume was a devout Protestant background, she has always taken Christmas the most seriously out of any holiday, while the family that she married into simply wants to celebrate Hanukkah quietly each year. But she wasn't going to have any of that, so she made the decision to center her entire persona around the holiday by opening a business that would allow her to celebrate Christmas for the entire year if she so chooses. In the case of Jake, at the time of his birth, she viewed him as a blank canvas, her way of truly sticking it to the family that she resents so deeply. As Jake grew up, she not only devoted her time to developing a unique sense of both love and trust with him, but she also indoctrinated him into the culture of Christmas obsession. This of course led Jake to a quick resentment of the rest of his family, but they tried to adapt by putting in the minimal effort required to celebrate the holiday so that they wouldn't lose him. Hence why they were begrudgingly putting up decorations the night before. But Grandma's control over his mind was growing too strong now that Jake was approaching adolescence. So once Frank and Rita overheard skeevy cousin Mel hatching a plan to ruin Grandma's business, they pulled Mel's strings quietly from the shadows, making her their scapegoat for taking Grandma out of the picture. After all, how would Mel know that whatever she poured into the fruitcake mix had the effect of reindeer nip? She didn't. But Frank and Rita Spankenheimer did. And why would Santa be flying over their house while everyone else was still awake? Because he never goes to their house in the first place, allowing them to stay up as late as they want. They knew this whole time that Santa was real, but they have been faking his arrival for years, all to make sure that their son would still love them. After the incident, when Jake runs downstairs, saying that Grandma was run over by Santa's reindeer, they purposely stalled for time, knowing full well that Santa would likely take the body away in an attempt to protect his image. They assumed her to be dead for months, as Cousin Mel pocketed Santa's note before they saw it. They were finally free from the burden of celebrating Christmas. But meanwhile at the North Pole, Grandma never had amnesia to begin with, and Santa knew this. Because on the sleigh ride back after he struck her down, she told him that this was a blessing in disguise, that this was her way of leaving her horrible family behind and spending the rest of her days in retirement bliss at the North Pole. The elves, however, wouldn't take too kindly to an outsider living rent-free in their home, so Grandma and Santa came up with a fake case of amnesia in order to trick them. But what Santa and Grandma didn't count on was one of the elves going rogue, bringing Jake to the North Pole in an attempt to restore Grandma's memories. So when they brought Grandma back, she willingly allowed Cousin Mel's lawyer to take her to the cabin in the woods, hoping that Santa would somehow come back to get her, as he does supposedly see everything. But instead it was Jake and Quincy, and she had to do this whole bullshit song and dance where somehow eating fruitcake brought her memory back. Thankfully, she was dealing with the two most gullible characters in the special, so of course, they bought it. The jig was up for everyone involved. Cousin Mel, lost. Rita and Frank, lost. Grandpa, well, he's still senile, so nothing really changed with him. But in that last minute of the special, as they leave the courthouse and Grandma is dreading having to go back to her family, she opens the reindeer nip fruitcake in a last-ditch effort, hoping that this time around, she will actually be killed. because in her mind, she was the one who lost. But that doesn't work because apparently her bones are made out of like adamantium or something. Yup, this whole time they're in the same universe as the X-Men. So now that I have all of that figured out, I think it's safe to say that Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer is perhaps the greatest Christmas special that's ever been made. So if you'll excuse me, I've been drinking too much eggnog and I have to go vomit now. Grandma got run over by a reindeer, walking home from our house Christmas Eve. You could say there's no such thing as Santa, but as for me and Grandpa, we believe. 2, 3, 4. Grandpa's gonna sue the pants off of Santa. You know that's what he's gonna do. Wahoo! Grandpa's gonna sue the pants off of Santa, 'cause Grandma would have wanted him to.